The USS Abraham Lincoln cut through the Pacific waters like a blade through silk, its massive nuclear-powered hull displacing thousands of tons of ocean as it made its way back to Naval Base Kitsap. Seaman recruit Tyler Jennings stood on the hangar deck, his crisp new uniform still stiff with that fresh-from-the-package feel, watching the other sailors move around him with the practiced efficiency of people who actually knew what they were doing. He'd been on the carrier for exactly 3 weeks, fresh out of boot camp in Great Lakes, and everything about this floating city of steel and jet fuel still felt surreal. The constant hum of machinery beneath his feet, the smell of aviation fuel mixed with salt water, the way senior chiefs barked orders that sent dozens of sailors scrambling in coordinated chaos. This was it. This was the real Navy, not the sanitized version they'd shown him in the recruiting videos back in his small Ohio hometown. Tyler adjusted his white Dixie cup hat and tried to look like he belonged here, like he wasn't completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of everything happening around him. He'd scored high on his ASVAB and requested aviation ordnance, dreaming of working with missiles and bombs, but they'd stuck him in deck department for now, which meant he spent most of his time chipping paint and swabbing decks alongside dozens of other junior sailors who all looked just as lost as he felt. The senior sailors moved past him without a second glance, their uniforms faded and comfortable, their movements automatic after years of muscle memory. Tyler noticed one man in particular, an elderly guy who had to be in his 70s, pushing a mop bucket across the non-skid surface with slow, methodical movements. The old man wore blue coveralls that had seen better days, his silver hair visible beneath a worn ball cap, his face weathered and lined like an old sea chart. Tyler had seen him around before, always cleaning something, always in the background, always alone. The kid figured he was some kind of civilian contractor, maybe a retired sailor who couldn't quite leave the Navy life behind and had taken a custodial job to stay connected to the fleet. It made sense. Tyler had heard stories about guys like that, men who'd given 30 years to the service and then didn't know what to do with themselves in the civilian world, so they came back in whatever capacity they could. The old man looked up briefly as Tyler watched him, their eyes meeting for just a second before the elderly worker went back to his mopping, his expression blank and distant. Tyler felt a pang of something, maybe pity or maybe fear, wondering if that would be him someday, too old to leave but too broken to really belong. He shook off the thought and headed toward the berthing area, needing to grab his gear before the evening breeze. The ship would be pulling into port tomorrow morning, and the entire crew was buzzing with anticipation of liberty, of stepping onto solid ground and tasting freedom for a few precious hours before the machine swallowed them back up again. The mess deck was packed during the evening meal, hundreds of sailors cramming into the cafeteria-style space, their trays clattering against the metal tables as they found seats among their divisions and friend groups. Tyler sat with 3 other junior sailors from deck department, all of them complaining about their division chief while shoveling down questionable chicken and overcooked vegetables. The conversation bounced between liberty plans, girls back home, and speculation about their next deployment. That's when Marcus Williams, a loudmouth second-class petty officer from engineering, raised his voice loud enough to cut through the ambient noise. Tyler looked up to see Williams standing near one of the back tables, pointing at the elderly man in coveralls, who sat alone with his tray, eating slowly and minding his own business. The old man had something pinned to his chest, a small medal that caught the harsh fluorescent light. Williams was laughing, but it wasn't a friendly sound. It was the kind of laughter that made everyone nearby stop talking and turn to watch. Tyler felt his stomach tighten. He'd seen this before, back in high school, the moment right before something ugly happened when the crowd started to gather and the air got thick with potential violence. Williams moved closer to the old man's table, his voice dripping with mockery as he addressed the growing audience more than the elderly worker himself. He said something about stolen valor, about how pathetic it was that some old janitor was wearing a Navy cross like he'd earned it, like he had any right to wear one of the highest decorations the Navy could award. The medal itself was small and unassuming, a bronze cross hanging from a blue and white ribbon, but Williams was pointing at it like it was evidence of a crime. Other sailors started gathering around, some of them nodding along with Williams, a few looking uncomfortable but not speaking up, the rest just excited to watch drama unfold. Tyler recognized the dynamic immediately. This was how it always went. Someone would start something, and everyone else would either join in or stay silent, because speaking up meant becoming the next target. The old man didn't respond at first. He just kept eating his meal, his weathered hands steady on his fork, his eyes focused on his tray like he'd seen this scene play out before, and knew better than to engage. But Williams wasn't satisfied with being ignored. He reached down and actually flicked the medal with his finger, the disrespect so blatant that several sailors gasped. Williams demanded to know where the old man had bought his fake medal, said there was no way some civilian janitor had earned a Navy Cross, suggested he'd probably picked it up at a pawn shop or ordered it online. The old man finally looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting Williams's angry glare, and for just a moment, Tyler saw something in that weathered face that made him catch his breath. It wasn't anger or fear, it was something deeper, something sad and resigned, like a man who'd been fighting the same battle for so long that he'd forgotten why it mattered. The old man spoke quietly, his voice barely audible over the mess deck noise, saying the medal was real, and that he'd earned it a long time ago. Williams exploded with laughter, and half the gathered sailors joined in, the sound harsh and cruel in the confined space. Word spread through the ship faster than fire through dry tinder. Within 20 minutes, it seemed like half the crew knew about the confrontation in the mess deck, and the story grew more dramatic with each retelling. Tyler heard 3 different versions before he even left the berthing area, each one painting the old man as either a con artist or a delusional faker. The consensus was clear: no way that old janitor had earned a Navy Cross. The medal was incredibly rare, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat, and fewer than 7,000 had been given out in the entire history of the United States Navy. The chances that some elderly civilian contractor pushing a mop on the Lincoln had actually earned one were astronomical. Tyler wanted to believe there was more to the story, but the evidence seemed damning. The old man wore coveralls, not a uniform. He worked as a janitor. He looked ancient, too old to have served in any recent conflicts where Navy Crosses were awarded. It didn't add up. Lieutenant Junior Grade Brad Morrison from the Lincoln's admin department apparently agreed, because he showed up in the mess deck about 30 minutes after the initial confrontation, his khaki uniform crisp and his expression stern as he demanded to see the old man's identification. Tyler watched from the doorway as Morrison questioned the elderly worker, his tone professional but clearly skeptical. Morrison was young for an officer, probably only a few years older than Tyler himself, a Mustang who'd come up through the enlisted ranks, and still carried himself with that chip-on-shoulder intensity of someone who had something to prove. He told the old man that wearing unauthorized military decorations was a federal crime, that stolen valor was taken very seriously by the Navy, and that he needed to see documentation proving the medal was legitimate. The old man reached into his coveralls with shaking hands and produced a worn wallet, extracting what looked like an old military ID card. Morrison examined it under the harsh lights, his brow furrowed, then shook his head. He said the ID looked old and possibly fake, that they'd need to verify everything through official channels, and that in the meantime, the old man needed to remove the medal and stop impersonating a decorated veteran. The gathered crowd murmured their approval. This was justice being served. This was the system working exactly as it should to protect the corner of real heroes. The old man's face showed no emotion as he unpinned the Navy Cross from his coveralls and held it in his weathered palm, staring at it like he was saying goodbye to an old friend. Morrison told him to report to the admin office first thing in the morning where they'd sort everything out properly. The implication was clear. The old man was in serious trouble. Tyler felt sick watching it unfold, not because he thought the officer was wrong, but because something about the whole scene felt off in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The old man shuffled away from the mess deck, clutching his medal, while sailors whispered and pointed behind his back. Williams and his friends were practically celebrating, high-fiving each other like they'd just accomplished something heroic themselves. Tyler went back to his rack that night, unable to shake the image of the old man's face, that resignation and sadness that seemed to go deeper than this single incident, like he was carrying weight that had nothing to do with a questioned man. Rear Admiral Patricia Chen had been commanding officer of Naval Base Kitsap for 18 months, and in that time she'd dealt with every kind of personnel issue imaginable, from domestic disputes to security breaches to the occasional sailor who thought rules didn't apply to them. But when Lieutenant Morrison's email landed in her inbox at 0600 the next morning, flagged as urgent and marked with concerning details about potential stolen valor on one of her ships, she felt something shift in her gut. Chen had served for 28 years, worked her way up from enlisted intelligence specialist to flag officer through sheer competence and an unwillingness to tolerate nonsense from anyone regardless of rank. She'd seen combat in Iraq, managed crises in the South China Sea, and buried enough sailors to know that military honor wasn't something to be taken lightly. If someone was actually wearing a fraudulent Navy cross, she'd personally ensure they faced the full weight of military justice. But something about Morrison's report bothered her. The details were sparse. An elderly civilian contractor, name listed as James R. Patterson, approximately 78 years old, employed by base facilities maintenance for the past 6 years, observed wearing what appeared to be a Navy Cross medal. When questioned, subject claimed medal was legitimately earned, but could not immediately provide documentation beyond an expired military ID. Morrison recommended immediate termination of employment and referral to federal authorities for prosecution under the Stolen Valor Act. Chen read through the report twice, then pulled up Patterson's employment file. The records showed basic information: social security number, address in Bremerton, next of kin listed as none, employment history showing 6 years of satisfactory performance reviews in custodial services. But the file was oddly thin, no military service record attached, no veterans preference documentation, nothing indicating how or why a man of his age had ended up pushing a mop on a carrier instead of enjoying retirement. Chen's instincts, honed by 3 decades of service, started screaming that something was wrong. She picked up her phone and called the base personnel office directly, bypassing the usual chain of command. She wanted Patterson's complete service record pulled immediately, wanted every piece of documentation the Navy had on him cross-referenced and verified. The personnel officer on duty stammered something about outdated filing systems and records that hadn't been digitized yet, that anything before the late 1990s was still in paper archives. But Chen didn't care about excuses. She wanted answers, and she wanted them before the end of the day. Then she made a second call, this one to the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, speaking directly to a records specialist she'd worked with on a previous historical project. She gave them Patterson's name, approximate age, and asked them to search their database for any Navy Cross recipients matching that profile. The specialist promised to call back within a few hours. Chen sat back in her chair staring at the photo Morrison had included in his report, a grainy phone picture showing an elderly man with silver hair and tired eyes, the small bronze cross visible on his chest. Something about his face nagged at her, a ghost of recognition she couldn't quite place. She'd seen that look before in the eyes of men who'd been places and done things they couldn't talk about, who carried their wars inside them long after the shooting started. The call came back at 14:30 hours, and Admiral Chen knew from the tone in the records specialist voice that everything was about to change. The specialist spoke carefully, precisely, like someone who'd just discovered something that rewrote their understanding of reality. They'd found James Robert Patterson in the archives, and what they'd found made Morrison's stolen valor accusation look like a sick joke. Patterson had enlisted in the Navy in January 1964, right in the middle of the Vietnam buildup, assigned to Underwater Demolition Team 11, after completing what was then the most brutal training pipeline in the military. UDT 11, the precursor to the modern SEAL teams, specialized in reconnaissance, demolitions, and direct action operations in riverine and coastal environments. Patterson had deployed to Vietnam in August 1965 as part of a classified unit operating in the Mekong Delta, conducting missions that weren't officially acknowledged until decades later. The records specialist read directly from Patterson's service jacket, and Chen felt chills running down her spine as the details emerged. Multiple combat deployments between 1965 and 1972, over 200 documented combat operations, 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars with V device for Valor, a Silver Star, and yes, a Navy Cross awarded for actions taken during a mission on March 18, 1968. The citation was classified at the time and had only been partially declassified in 1998, but what Chen could read made her throat tight. Patterson and his 5-man team had been tasked with rescuing 3 captured Navy pilots from a fortified enemy compound deep in hostile territory. The mission had gone wrong from the start. Their insertion had been compromised, their extraction helicopter shot down, and they'd found themselves cut off behind enemy lines with wounded prisoners and a battalion-sized enemy force converging on their position. According to the citation, Patterson had single-handedly held off enemy fighters for over 3 hours while his team evacuated the wounded, using captured weapons when his own ammunition ran out, sustaining multiple injuries himself, but refusing evacuation until every other man was safely aboard the backup helicopter. 2 members of his team didn't make it home. Patterson spent 4 months recovering from his wounds at a naval hospital in Okinawa before rotating back to Vietnam for another tour. Chen sat in stunned silence as the specialist continued reading, detailing a career that spanned 9 years of active duty, followed by an honorable discharge in 1973, with a disability rating of 70% due to injuries sustained in combat. After that, the records went quiet. No mention of what Patterson had done for the next 50 years, no indication of how or why he'd ended up working as a janitor on the Abraham Lincoln, living alone in Bremerton with no family and a service record that read like something out of a war movie. Chen thanked the specialist and hung up, then sat staring at her computer screen for a long moment, her mind racing through implications and consequences. She thought about Morrison's smug report, about the sailors who'd mocked and humiliated Patterson in the mess deck, about Tyler and all the other young service members who had no idea what real sacrifice looked like because they'd grown up in an era where wars were distant abstractions fought by volunteers, while the rest of the country went about their business. Admiral Chen ordered an all-hands call for the USS Abraham Lincoln crew the following morning at 0800, mandatory attendance for every sailor not on watch, no exceptions. The crew filed into the hangar bay, converted into a temporary briefing space, confused and restless, because all-hands calls usually meant bad news or another safety lecture nobody wanted to sit through. Tyler found a spot near the middle, surrounded by sailors from various departments, all of them speculating about what could possibly require assembling the entire ship's company. Morrison stood near the front looking confident, probably assuming this was about stolen valor procedures or security protocols, while Williams and his engineering buddies lounged in the back making jokes. The Admiral walked in exactly on time, her service dress blues immaculate, her bearing radiating authority, and beside her walked James Patterson. The old man wore his coveralls, his silver hair neatly combed, his weathered face expressionless, and pinned to his chest was the Navy Cross that had started everything. The room fell silent immediately. Chen approached the podium and spoke without preamble, her voice carrying across the hangar bay with crystal clarity. She told them they were going to have a conversation about honor, about respect, and about the cost of assumptions. She told them about James Robert Patterson, Underwater Demolition Team 11, Vietnam veteran, holder of the Navy Cross, 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Silver Star. She told them about March 18, 1968, about a mission deep in enemy territory, about a choice between saving his teammates or saving himself, about 3 hours of sustained combat against overwhelming odds, about wounds that still caused him pain. 57 years later, Chen's voice never wavered as she detailed Patterson's service record, but Tyler could see the fury behind her professional composure. She pulled up photographs on the projection screen, black and white images from Vietnam showing young men with hard eyes and harder missions, and there in the center of one photo was Patterson, decades younger but unmistakably the same man, wearing camouflage and carrying weapons that looked older than Tyler himself. The silence in the hangar bay was absolute. Chen let the images speak for themselves for a long moment before continuing. She addressed Morrison directly, asking him if he'd bothered to actually verify anything before filing his report, if he'd done even basic research before accusing a decorated war hero of stolen valor. Morrison's face had gone pale, his confident posture collapsing into something that looked like he wanted the deck to open up and swallow him whole. Then Chen turned her attention to Williams, asking him to stand up, asking him to explain to the entire assembled crew what had possessed him to mock and physically disrespect a Navy Cross recipient in front of dozens of witnesses. Williams couldn't form words, just stammered something incoherent while his friends suddenly found the deck very interesting. Chen let the moment stretch until it became unbearable. Then she addressed the entire crew. She told them that every single person who'd participated in or witnessed the harassment of Patterson and done nothing to stop it should be ashamed. She told them the Navy was built on honor and respect, that the uniform they wore had been earned by the blood and sacrifice of sailors who came before them, and that what happened in that mess deck was a disgrace to everything the service stood for. Tyler found Patterson 3 hours after the all-hands call, sitting alone in the ship's small chapel that most sailors didn't even know existed, tucked away in a quiet corner of the Lincoln, where the constant machinery noise faded to a distant hum. The old man sat in one of the wooden pews, holding his Navy cross in both hands, turning it over slowly like he was trying to remember something important. Tyler hesitated in the doorway, not sure if he should intrude, not sure what he even wanted to say, but something pulled him forward. He asked if he could sit down. Patterson looked up, those pale blue eyes studying Tyler's face for a moment, before nodding slowly. They sat in silence for several minutes, just two sailors separated by 50 years, and an ocean of experience neither could fully articulate. Finally, Tyler spoke, his voice quiet in the chapel's stillness. He apologized for not speaking up in the mess deck, for letting Williams and Morrison do what they did without saying anything, for assuming the worst about someone he didn't know. Patterson smiled, a sad expression that didn't quite reach his eyes, and told Tyler not to worry about it. He said he'd stopped expecting people to understand a long time ago, that most folks who hadn't been where he'd been couldn't really grasp what it meant to wear that medal, couldn't comprehend the weight of memories that came with it. Tyler asked why Patterson worked as a janitor, why he didn't tell people about his service, why he seemed content to be invisible when he'd earned the right to be celebrated. Patterson was quiet for a long time before answering, his voice barely above a whisper. He talked about coming home from Vietnam in 1973, to a country that didn't want to hear about what he'd done, didn't want to acknowledge the war at all, let alone honor the men who'd fought it. He talked about struggling with nightmares and survivor's guilt, about the friends who didn't make it home, about feeling like he'd left the best parts of himself in the jungle and couldn't figure out how to function in normal society anymore. He talked about failed relationships and jobs he couldn't hold, and decades of just trying to make it through each day without falling apart completely. He'd found his way back to the Navy 6 years ago, taking a custodial job because it was the only place that felt like home, the only environment where the rules made sense, and he could contribute something meaningful even if nobody noticed him. He wore his medals sometimes because they reminded him that he'd once been someone who mattered, who'd done something important, even if that person felt like a stranger now. Tyler listened without interrupting, feeling something crack open in his chest as Patterson spoke, understanding for the first time that heroism wasn't a moment frozen in glory, but a lifetime of carrying weight that never got lighter. He asked Patterson what it felt like to earn the Navy Cross, expecting some story about pride or honor, or patriotic fervor. Instead, Patterson said it felt like failure, because he couldn't save everyone, because 2 men died on his watch, and no medal could change that basic fact. The cross wasn't a prize or an achievement, it was a reminder of the worst day of his life, and a responsibility to live in a way that honored the men who didn't get to come home. The USS Abraham Lincoln pulled into Naval Base Kitsap 2 days later, under clear skies, the massive carrier maneuvering into its berth with the precision of decades of practice. Tyler stood on the flight deck in his dress uniform, one of 200 sailors assembled in formation for a ceremony that Admiral Chen had personally ordered. Patterson stood at the center of attention, wearing a dress uniform that someone had procured for him, the ribbons and medals on his chest, representing a lifetime of service that most of the assembled crew were only beginning to understand. Chen herself presided over the ceremony, speaking briefly about the importance of institutional memory, about how easy it was for each generation to forget the sacrifices made by those who came before, about the responsibility every service member carried to honor and respect the chain of warriors that stretched back to the founding of the Republic. She announced that Patterson was being formally recognized for his service, that his employment status was being changed from civilian contractor to special advisor for veteran affairs on the base, that his story would be documented and preserved for future sailors to learn from. She also announced disciplinary actions for Morrison and Williams, both of whom were being reduced in rank and reassigned, their careers permanently marked by their failure to uphold the Navy's core values. But more than the ceremony itself, Tyler would remember what happened afterward. The formation was dismissed, and instead of sailors rushing to get off the ship for liberty, dozens of them approached Patterson, shaking his hand, asking questions about his service, actually seeing him for the first time as a person, rather than background scenery. Tyler watched the old man's face slowly transform, the resignation and sadness giving way to something that looked almost like peace, like maybe after 50 years of invisibility he was finally being acknowledged in a way that mattered. Tyler himself approached last, waiting until the crowd had thinned, and asked Patterson if he'd be willing to talk more sometime, to share his stories so that younger sailors could learn from them. Patterson looked at him with those pale blue eyes that had seen things Tyler couldn't imagine, and nodded slowly. He said he'd like that maybe it was finally time to stop hiding from his past, and start using it to help the next generation understand what service really meant. As Tyler walked down the gangway towards solid ground and a weekend of liberty, he realized something fundamental had shifted in how he understood the Navy and his place in it. The uniform wasn't just a job or an adventure or a path to benefit. It was a continuation of something larger, a link in a chain connecting him to men like Patterson, who'd paid prices Tyler was only beginning to comprehend. He looked back at the Lincoln, massive and imposing against the evening sky, and thought about all the invisible people moving through its corridors, the ones nobody noticed until something forced them into visibility. He thought about assumptions and judgments and the human tendency to dismiss what couldn't be immediately categorized and understood. Most of all, he thought about that Navy Cross and what it represented, not glory or heroism in the abstract, but specific moments of impossible choices made by real people in conditions beyond imagination, and the decades of consequences those moments create. Tyler made himself a promise right there on the pier, surrounded by sailors rushing toward their cars and freedom. He would never again assume someone's story based on how they looked or what job they did. He would ask questions instead of making judgment. He would remember that everyone carrying weight deserved respect, especially those who carried it quietly without demanding recognition. The sun was setting over Puget Sound, painting the water gold and crimson, and somewhere behind him on that massive carrier, an old warrior was finally, after 5 decades of invisibility, being